This is a Chinese monster for high-speed construction, a machine that lifts a concrete beam weighing 1,000 tons, stretches itself from one bridge support to another by 40 meters, and installs it right there. This is how quickly China builds a bridge, along which, for the first time on the planet, trains will rush right over the sea at a speed of 350 kilometers per hour. And here they have also learned to build skyscrapers in 19 days, hospitals in 10 days, and residential buildings literally in a single day from scratch. They have laid more high-speed railways than the entire world combined. Stadiums, underwater tunnels, 100-kilometer bridges. Stop. Everything I've just listed can actually be summed up in one sentence. How did China go from a poor village to the world's leading builder and investor? And why is this only the beginning? Do you know what unites the new Moscow metro station, Michurinsky Prospect, the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia, a seaport in Sri Lanka, and a section of the new Moscow-Kazan highway? All of these are being built, or were built, by the Chinese. Now, to get a sense of the real scale of their appetite, let's look at the whole map. Take Africa. In which countries on the continent do you think Chinese construction is happening right now? In all of them, except this small one here. In Nigeria, they gave $5 billion for a huge hydroelectric power plant. The largest bridge in Africa, in Mozambique, is being built with Chinese money. In 2017 in Kenya, they built a 500-plus kilometer railway at a speed of 700 meters per day. This was Chinese workmanship. Even on the Cabo Verde Islands, way out here in the ocean, the Chinese somehow managed to throw up housing, a dam, a stadium, and the local parliament building. Now attention, how much money does China make on construction in Africa? In 2003, it was $2.5 billion, already not bad, but now it's 25 times more. Every year, almost 50 billion steadily. Why China? Why Africa? It's logical. There's little money, but a lot of opportunity. Here the Chinese test their skills for how they will conquer the world without guns. So what are the main advantages of Chinese construction? First, they do it faster than anyone. Second, cheaper than anyone. And third, they're happy to build on credit. Let's take specific examples of what faster and cheaper mean. Look at these drilling machines. Right now, China is in a boom of tunnel construction for high-speed railways, metro systems, and all in the harshest conditions. Here they are carving a direct path into Tibet, inside mountains at altitudes of several thousand meters, where there's barely any oxygen. Or they are digging the longest undersea tunnel with this kind of equipment, progressing at 10 meters per day, costing only $10 million per kilometer. For comparison, in the USA, the same 1 kilometer of tunnel would cost $50 million. In Moscow, according to official data, metro construction costs from $60 to $93 million per kilometer. So, cheap and fast, clear enough. And why on credit? Here's a concrete example. In 2008, Sri Lanka, loved by many Russian tourists, ambitiously decided to invest in its own development and build a new deep-water port. But they had no money. Relations with the West were lukewarm. In the end, the Chinese kindly agreed to build the port. Of course, not for free, but on credit. However, business at the port didn't take off. It became unprofitable. And on top of that, Sri Lanka had to pay back more than $1 billion in loans. As you remember, they had no money. But the Chinese, being kind guys, were ready to forgive the debt. On one condition, Sri Lanka would lease the port to them for 99 years. After all, they didn't build it for nothing. And so, in 2017, Sri Lanka agreed, which means they essentially handed over part of their territory.
Sri Lanka has a very weak industrial base, so there's little internal demand. We are slowly developing this port and will continue reaching out to potential markets and customers.
The same thing might happen with Kenya's port of Mombasa, the one where the Chinese built 500 kilometers of railway in record time. Naturally, not for free, but on credit with interest. Kenya's debt to China is now almost $5 billion. There are court battles going on, but Kenya has apparently decided to answer the Russian way. So I think you understand the Chinese method. As US President John Adams once said, there are two ways to conquer a nation. One is by the sword, the other by debt. China usually chooses the second. But how did China suddenly leap forward so sharply? And how long will their power last? Because if you remember, in the mid-20th century, everyone admired Japan's economy, technology, and construction, and then everything suddenly stopped. Let's rewind 40, or better, 50 years back. Late 1960s, the Soviet Union is building at full speed, including typical metro stations. And here come Chinese builders to consult with. They were only just planning to dig a subway in Beijing, so they came to learn, or, as history would later show, to cut off all the best ideas. But at that time, Western videographers admired not the Chinese, but Soviet-scale construction. Meanwhile, China was nothing special. Planned economy, portraits of leaders, communist slogans. Even in Asia, things were going much better for the likes of Korea and Japan, which were in a real economic boom.
The most consistently high growth rate in the world, single-figure inflation, and just 2% unemployment.
Now follow the numbers. In 1980, 70% of Soviet citizens lived in cities, about 200 million people. In the same year in China, also 200 million people lived in cities. But the difference was that China's population wasn't 288 million like the USSR, but 1 billion. That means 800 million were still in the countryside, living on less than $2 a day, working inefficiently. This was essentially new oil and an enormous supply of cheap labor. They just had to figure out how to get it out of the fields and put it to use. In 1980, new Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping decided to run an experiment. Before that, he had visited Singapore and was apparently shocked at how well things could work. Then comes my favorite story, how the fishing village of Shenzhen, with 30,000 residents, in 40 years turned into China's Silicon Valley with 12 million people. How did it happen? Deng Xiaoping made Shenzhen a special economic zone for foreign companies. China offered this. 1. Shenzhen will be built and developed only with your foreign investments because we have no money, only a billion hands. To attract investments, foreigners were exempted from duties and corporate taxes. If you have no profit, you pay nothing. If you have profit, you get another 5 years of tax holidays. There were many more incentives. Everything produced in Shenzhen would be for export, for hard currency. 4. And Shenzhen was chosen deliberately. Just across the way was Hong Kong and Taiwan, booming with economic growth, and China managed to ride that wave. For 40 years, Shenzhen's GDP grew by 20% annually, rising from $40 million to $400 billion. What does this have to do with construction technology? Remember how the Chinese metro builders came to Moscow to learn? Now, they didn't have to go anywhere. They made all the builders come to them, bringing money and technology. A good example, in 2005, both China and Russia had the same problem. Large distances between cities, no high-speed trains. Both turned to foreigners for help. Russia signed a contract with Siemens to run Sapson trains, essentially replacing outdated ER-200s. Initially, the plan was to produce them in Russia in a joint venture. Cost 2 billion euros. But in the end, Russia simply bought them from the Germans for $276 million, plus $350 million for maintenance. In 17 years, Russia got just 2 high-speed lines, Moscow-Petersburg and Moscow-Nizhny Novgorod. China, also without high-speed trains of its own, did something similar but smarter. They brought in Siemens, Bombardier, Hitachi, but with one condition: technology transfer. Our development cannot benefit only foreign economies, as local leaders said. In 17 years, China poured $300 billion into high-speed rail, roughly Russia's entire annual budget, and built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed lines, more than the rest of the world combined. Now they have a full range of high-speed trains of their own, like the CRH 380, capable of 350 kilometers per hour, developed with foreign help but produced entirely in China. Yes, many lines are still unprofitable, but the technology leap they triggered spilled far beyond China. The same in skyscraper construction. In 30 years, they've built as many as the US did in the entire 20th century. Half of the 10 tallest buildings today are in China, and half of the 50 most high-rise cities are Chinese. They love to show their capabilities. In Changsha, they built a 57-story skyscraper in 19 days, or 30 stories in 15 days, using prefabricated steel modules made in factories and assembled like Lego. They even planned the tallest building in the world, 220 stories in 90 days, but later banned skyscrapers over 500 meters, and in smaller cities over 250 meters for safety and livability reasons. Inside China, 65% now live in cities, just like the USSR in the 1980s. So they're looking abroad for projects, and Africa is the prime target. But cases like Sri Lanka, Kenya, and Ecuador show the risk, when debts can lead to losing assets, control, or resources. In total, China has invested $300 billion in African construction, but much of what they build remains Chinese-owned due to debt. Millions of Chinese now work there, and local budgets maintain the infrastructure. Locals work for low pay. Chinese expansion will only grow as domestic opportunities narrow. Much like the USSR's industrialization, China is redirecting labor from low-productivity sectors to industry and technology, boosting growth without any single miraculous invention, just better use of resources and massive state investment. So be strong, invest in yourself and your future, and until the future.